Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. Welcome back to another video on Palestinian Arabic. Today we're taking a break with a short and simple video that's about a topic that's nonetheless very important, and that is negation. So how do we say no in Palestinian Arabic? It's rather different from Fusha, but it's actually easier. So I'm sure you've all heard the word la, meaning no. This word of course exists in Fusha and it's absolutely used in Ammiya, but here's the thing. Just like in English actually, la means no, but it's only used like that, by itself, meaning it's not actually used for negation. So in English, the actual word for negation isn't actually no, it's not. So I do not want, I am not French, etc. Whereas no is just the opposite of yes. It's an answer to a yes or no question and whatnot. So unlike in Fusha, in Palestinian Arabic, la can't be used for negation. It's only like as a standalone word, an answer to a question, etc. So how do you actually negate things in Ammiya? It's easy, but those who've studied Fusha might be thrown off, because the word you use is ma. So ma in Ammiya essentially means not, even though in Fusha it's generally not used this way, and most often it actually means what, as in the question word, so be careful about that. But in Ammiya it means not, so for example, ba'arif means I know, but ma ba'arif means I don't know. It's very simple. Likewise in the past tense, ruhat means I went, ma ruhat means I didn't go. And it's the same thing when you use auxiliary verbs and stuff like that. So rah aruh is I'm going to go. And to negate that, it's just ma rah aruh. And that includes pseudo verbs like biddi. So ma biddi is I don't want. Ma biddi aruh is I don't want to go. And you can even have ma kunt biddi aruh in the past tense. So I didn't want to go. So definitely get used to using ma, and really as far as its placement, just know that it goes at the very beginning of the verbal phrase, behind whatever auxiliary terms and whatnot that you might use. Now there's actually another term that you can use for negation, and it's kind of weird, but I kind of got addicted to it. I feel like it sounds more natural or slangy for some reason. Anyway, instead of putting it at the beginning of the verbal phrase, you actually put it at the end. But the super weird thing about it is that it's actually a suffix, not a separate word. And that suffix is the letter sheen. So how does it work? Well, let's take the examples we've done so far and add in the sheen. Now keep in mind though, that most of the time you can use either ma or sheen or both. In fact, I often use both. So in the following examples, I'm going to mix and match depending on what feels right, because again, there's not really a right or wrong way to go about it. So instead of ma ba'arif, for example, you'd say ba'arfish. And if that seems weird to you right now, trust me, you'll hear this exact phrase a billion times. So it's just way too common for me not to mention it. And you can of course say ma ba'arifish also. As for the past tense though, in the case of ma ruhat, you can say ma ruhtish, but just ruhtish doesn't feel right just by itself. And I confirmed that with another friend, by the way, so you can take my word for it that although in the present tense you can just use the sheen for negation, so ba'arifish, in the past tense try not to use it by itself. One very important thing to point out is that the sheen is not used on the subjunctive. So in ma rah aruh, you can't use sheen. Now why is that? Well, it's because the sheen is attached to the verb it's negating. I guess if you think about it, the subjunctive is this unreal verb. You're not actually going, you're going to go. So if I want to say I'm going to go, I would actually negate the going. But in this case, that's conveyed by rah, which isn't even a verb, so you're kind of left without options. So you don't add the sheen to aruh, nor to rah. So you just have to use ma. But here's the thing, if you're using auxiliary verbs that aren't actually verbs, then you can negate them with sheen. So for example, ma bhab aruh, I don't want to go. You can, in this case, add the sheen to bhab, since it's an actual real verb. So it's bhabbish aruh. So again, the main finicky thing about negation with sheen is that you can't attach it to the subjunctive or basically to anything that's not a proper verb. So in this case, rah. The slight exception to this are the pseudo verbs like indi and biddi, since they're basically treated like verbs usually. So you can say ma biddi or biddish, which is another super common thing to say. Biddish, biddush, bidnash, and as an auxiliary verb, biddish aruh, just as you'd say bhabbish aruh. And in the past tense, notice here that you negate the main verb. So instead of ma kunt biddi, you can say ma kuntsh biddi, or even ma kuntsh biddi aruh. And again, notice that the sheen is on the kunt here rather than the biddi, because it's the core verb in this case. It's actually modifying biddi by putting it in the past tense. And in fact, if biddi were a normal verb, it would actually be in the subjunctive here. But of course, biddi doesn't have a subjunctive, so it just stays the same. Anyway, just to summarize, for past tense verbs, you should use the ma no matter what, since you can use sheen but not by itself. Whereas in the present, any combination works. And in the subjunctive, the sheen doesn't work at all, but that's just because the subjunctive wouldn't be the core verb of the phrase to begin with. So believe it or not, I do think you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly, but when in doubt, I would say ma is definitely safer to use than sheen, so beginners might want to stick to that for now. By the way, this is kind of a dumb aside, but some lazy people don't write ma as a separate word, and instead write stuff like this. Don't be that person. It's confusing, especially for learners, especially like, what the heck is this? I mean, it's just a nightmare for learners. But hey, as a learner, now you know what's going on if you ever come across an abomination like that, which you probably will at some point. Okay, so thus far we've been talking about verbs. Past, present, future, pseudo-verbs, auxiliary verbs, all that jazz. Last thing I should mention though is how to negate the imperative, because it's a little bit different, but still pretty easy. So you already know how to actually give a command, right? So for example, ruh is go. I'm telling you to go. Remember, it's basically the same as the present tense, but without the ba prefixes. So that's why you have rah in the past, buruh in the present, and then the command is just ruh. Again, if you want to refresh on that, check out my video on the imperative. So here's the thing. Negating the imperative isn't actually negating the imperative form of the verb per se. What you're actually going to do is take the second person subjunctive, whether it's enta or enti or entu, of course, so that would be truh, truhi, or truhu. And that's what you're going to add the ma to. So ruh is go, but don't go is matruh. So again, basically what you're doing is taking the subjunctive, so the sort of root of the present tense, and that's what you're negating. As opposed to saying ma ruh, which is wrong. Do not attach the ma to the imperative directly, because that's wrong. And by the way, you can totally use sheen here for whatever reason in this case. So for example, matruhish works, and even just truhish is fine too in this case. Okay, now we can move on to something a little different, which is how to negate nominal sentences. So sentences where the verb is to be, but because the sentence is in the present, there's just no verb at all. So for example, al-bayt kabir. This is going to blow your mind. Actually, the word that's used here is a mashup of ma and the sheen suffix. I have no idea if that's on purpose, but it's really neat. So the word is actually mish. And basically you can just put it where the verb to be seems to belong. So you'd say al-bayt mish kabir. Again, weird but really cool and easy to remember. It's almost like the ma and the sheen were trying to negate the to be, but since the word isn't actually there, they just kind of got stuck together. Again, this is always and only used to negate nouns. So to say something is not something else. And I guess by default it's only used in the present, because if you were going to say that in the past tense, so al-bayt kan kabir, then you actually have a verb now, so you'd negate it accordingly. So it's al-bayt ma kanish kabir. Alright, the last thing I want to mention is not actually related to negation, but it relates to the word ma. So I have to say it because otherwise you'll be confused in the future. This is actually inherited from fusha, but ma, especially after a preposition or a question word, is like in English adding the suffix ever to certain words. So I'm just going to give you some examples so you can see what I mean. So shu biddak means, of course, what do you want? But if you say shu ma biddak, I don't want you to read the ma and the biddak together, but instead the shu and the ma together. That's what's going together here. Because it's not what don't you want, which is a weird question anyway and barely makes sense. Instead, the shu ma actually means whatever. So the phrase isn't even a question. It actually just means whatever you want. Likewise, when means where. So when ma is wherever. And when ma biddak is wherever you want, or anywhere you want. In fact, you can translate it however you want. And by the way, however you want is zay ma biddak. Because zay means like or as, so it's the equivalent of saying as you like, or again, however you want. As you can see, you can use it with a lot of different question words and prepositions. Ad ma biddak is as much as you want, because ad by itself just means like an amount or an extent. It takes a little bit of abstract thinking to infer the right meaning the first time you see some of these expressions, but I think now that you know how to interpret it, you should really be able to catch on quickly. A full example sentence might be, روح ما بدك تروح means go with whoever you want to go. Again, remember, you're always looking at the ma in these cases as modifying the word before it, not as negating the verb after it. Anyway, that's all I had for today. Negation in Arabic is really not too hard as long as you remember to use ma and sheen for verbs, mish for nouns, and of course la is just as a general word for no. So now go try it yourself and I'll catch you next time. اهلا حبايبي، شكرا للجماعة اللي بيحضروا القناة. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضية بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعليم اللهجة الفلسطينية بتقدروا تلاقوه بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالدسكريبشن، وبشوفكم المرة الجاية.